Hello, this is Dr. James Camp of Lee College in Baytown, Texas, and this is my introduction to the lymphatic circulation. All right, so the lymphatic system consists of two components. There's a circulatory system, which collects and returns excess tissue fluid to the blood, and also serves a second purpose of transporting absorbed lipids from the GI tract to the blood. The other half of the lymphatic system, which we'll cover differently in a different presentation, is the lymphatic tissues and organs. This is the part of the lymphatic system that's responsible for hosting your immune system and defending your body against foreign organisms and controlling tumors and cancers. We're going to focus on the lymphatic circulation in this presentation. So, how does lymphatic fluid or lymph flow? Well, if you recall from my earlier presentations on the cardiovascular system, any circulatory system has to have three parts. We've covered the three pumps of the body already: the heart, the skeletal muscle pumps, and the respiratory pump. We've covered one set of pipes, the cardiovascular system, but there's another set of pipes, an alternate flow pathway called the lymphatic system, where capillaries drain into vessels, which drain into trunks, which drain into ducts, which ultimately return the fluid to the blood. And we're going to cover today a different fluid called lymph. Okay, so as you can see here, blood has one way of getting around the body, which is to flow completely through a blood capillary and then follow the venous system back to the heart. But some of the fluid, as what we're about to explore, makes it out of the blood vasculature and has to travel back through lymphatic vessels. Eventually we get collected into lymph trunks, which all get collected into lymph ducts, which then return the blood to the venous system just before it reaches the heart. So in a sense, the lymphatic system is kind of a half circulatory system. It picks up some of the fluid that's provided by the cardiovascular system and returns it ultimately to the cardiovascular system. Okay, so how does that work? You can imagine blood flowing a little bit at a time through a blood capillary. Okay, we've got two components here. We've got the blood cells, which are happily drifting along through the blood capillary, and we've got the blood plasma. Okay, now you'll notice that I drew this blood capillary as a dotted line. That's because most blood capillaries are not completely sealed. Okay, they allow some leakage of fluid. Blood plasma, which I've drawn here as being this purple liquid here, okay, can leak out into a space called the interstitial fluid to feed the tissue. So you can imagine a little bit of this blood flowing out here, this blood plasma, not whole blood. We don't leak blood cells. And then this interstitial fluid travels through the tissue, and most of it returns to the blood. But there's a portion that doesn't. If you count my arrows, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 arrows providing blood to the tissue, only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 arrows pulling interstitial fluid back into the blood capillary. So that leaves us with this one arrow left that isn't going to go back to the blood. Okay, That extra interstitial fluid becomes lymph, which travels out through a lymphatic capillary and will ultimately mix back into the blood later on. Okay, we've talked about that conceptually. Let's put some numbers to it. Blood has two pressures that we are concerned about. One is called the capillary pressure or the hydrostatic pressure. That's the actual blood pressure that you can measure with a blood pressure cuff. The other is called the osmotic pressure, and it's represented instead of with a P, with a Greek letter P or a pi. Okay. The capillary pressure tends to push blood out of a vessel. The hydrostatic pressure tends to push blood out of a vessel. The osmotic pressure tends to pull fluid back into the vessel. So if we take 35 and subtract 28, we end up with about 9. Okay. We have this arrow here driving about 9 millimeters worth of pressure out of the blood. Okay. That's also taking into account the pressures in the interstitial fluid itself. Okay. So 35 minus 28 is not actually 9, in case you did the math. So it also takes these numbers into account. But we have about 9 millimeters of pressure pushing blood out into the fluid. That's not a lot, okay, but it's enough to drive a small amount of something called Starling flow. This is named after a physician named Starling, who could, I guess, be given credit as the first biomedical engineer. He did a lot of experiments on blood flow and trying to quantify and measure that. And what he determined is that blood plasma flows out of the tissue, mixes with the interstitial fluid so that we have a flow of interstitial fluid through the tissue, and then ultimately returns to the blood capillaries, because we have this second arrow here that says the capillary pressure, the hydrostatic pressure is now 15, the osmotic pressure is still 28, and we have different numbers at the far end of the tissue because we've picked up some extra blood plasma that's created some extra hydrostatic or some extra osmotic pressure. Anyway, we end up with 8 net millimeters pushing blood back into the vessel. Now you'll notice 8 is not the same as 8.9. So we have a different driving force pushing blood back into the capillary than we had pulling it out in the first place. And because of that, we end up with a little bit of excess. Okay, so to fill in our little blanks down here, at the start of the capillary bed, the high pressure pushes blood plasma out of the capillaries and into the interstitial fluid. At the end of the capillary bed, the low pressure sucks some, but not all, of the mixed fluid back into the venule. Okay, the extra blood, the extra fluid that remains becomes lymph. And that's what we're going to be concerned about today, is what happens to that fluid. How much fluid are we talking about? About 830 milliliters per hour of blood plasma filters out into the tissue beds. But then about 700 milliliters per hour filter back into the blood capillaries. So if you can do your basic math, 830 minus 700 leaves about 130 milliliters per hour of fluid that's lost from the blood. Now that's over the entire body, so that doesn't mean each tissue in your body is picking up 130 mils per hour. But to give you a sense of how much fluid that is, imagine that a typical bottled water bottle is about 500 milliliters. So this is about 1/4 of a water bottle per hour that's being lost all over your body. Or in other words, every 4 hours, you've lost an entire 500 ml water bottle throughout your body. So it's obvious that that fluid has to go somewhere. We're not losing all of that fluid. Okay, so to summarize, blood plasma flows out of the capillary bed at the start of the tissue. Interstitial fluid flows back into the capillary bed, or it flows into the lymphatic system. So what is the composition of this mixed fluid? Or I can call it, instead of interstitial fluid, we can call this mixed fluid because it's a mixture of blood plasma and interstitial fluid, tissue fluid. This travel of fluid through the tissue, by the way, known as Starling flow, but it's also known as the microcirculation. It's a circulation of a microscopic amount of fluid through a microscopic tissue rather than through blood capillaries. So what is the composition of this mixed fluid? Well, it's got plasma. It's going to lose some proteins, but not all. Some proteins do make it out into the tissue. It's going to lose nutrients because the tissue is going to use up those nutrients, and it's going to gain wastes. Okay. It's also going to gain, and in the somewhat more disturbing category, it's going to gain pathogens that might have been in this tissue. If we had little bacteria or virus particles in this tissue, they would get mixed in with this fluid and sucked either back into the blood, or they would get sucked into the lymph. And that's what we're counting on, is that the lymph is going to be able to detect these pathogens and provide specific immunity to the body. And also because of that, we have little lymphocytes scattered throughout that leave the tissue, and they also enter the lymph, and that's why they're called lymphocytes. Okay. In case you're wondering how this lymph gets pushed and pulled around, it gets transported through the lymphatic vessels by pressure from the interstitial fluid. That is, as pressure builds up in the tissue, it forces fluid out. And by milking action of skeletal muscles, just like with your veins, and the pressure from your breathing movements, the respiratory pump, again, rather like your veins. But sometimes one of these lymph vessels gets blocked, and that leads to a buildup of fluid upstream of that clog, and that buildup is called edema or lymphedema, a buildup of fluid in your tissues and interstitial spaces that causes swelling and discomfort. Okay, now quickly I want to talk about the anatomy of the lymphatic system. We go from lymphatic capillaries, which are found in most organs. They're not found in our two hard tissue organs, bone and teeth. They're not found in the bone marrow, and they're not found in the central nervous system. There are lymphatic capillaries on the membranes around the central nervous system, the pia mater, for example, but not within. Once you cross the blood-brain barrier, there are no lymphatic capillaries there. Those lymphatic capillaries drain to lymphatic collecting vessels. Okay. those move through a series of lymph nodes. So you may have several collecting vessels going into a lymph node, but only one or two coming out. Eventually, you get larger structures called lymph trunks. Okay, and then all of those filter into one or two very large structures called lymph ducts. So let's tour them in order. Lymphatic capillaries look a lot like blood capillaries, except they're what we call blind-ended. They have a little cul-de-sac at one end. And unlike blood capillaries, they have the endothelial cells meet in these little flap-like structures that allow the flap to fold one way so that fluid can travel in, but then close so that fluid can't travel back out. They're called mini valves. Okay. Lymphatic collecting vessels are found in most parts of your body and do not have names like the blood vessels of the cardiovascular system. They're just called lymphatic vessels of the arm or something like that. So you're not going to have to learn any vessel anatomy, which is good. Lymph nodes come in particular clusters, some of which have different names depending on which book or which internet reference you're looking at. This picture over on the left shows some of the more, one of the more comprehensive lists of lymph nodes I've found, but even that is not 100% correct. There are some other groups of lymph nodes that I've found on other references that aren't listed on this one. The picture over here on the right shows a drainage map that indicates that below the knee, lymph drains pretty much to the popliteal nodes. Above the knee, it drains pretty much to the inguinal nodes. From the arm, we drain first to the cubital nodes and then to the axillary nodes. Above there, we have some submandibular nodes. Again, that's one that's not even listed on this one. And we have some cervical nodes that process fluid draining from the head and neck. This is by far not a comprehensive list, but these are some of the ones that most references agree are important to know. Cervical, axillary, intestinal, aortic are also sometimes given other names, the ones on the posterior of the abdominal wall. The iliac nodes drain the pelvic organs, and the inguinal nodes drain the lower limbs. Once we leave the major collections of lymph nodes, we enter one of the trunks. Okay, and I'm going to try to kind of color code the trunks here. We have an intestinal trunk, which comes in from the small intestine. We have a pair of lumbar trunks, right and left. Okay. Those drain into a structure called the cisterna chyli that I'll explain in just a moment. We have jugular trunks that follow the jugular veins down from the upper body, from the head. Okay. We have subclavian trunks that follow the subclavian veins in from the arms and the clavicles. And then there's a pair of bronchomediastinal trunks that drain fluid from the bronchi, the lung area, and the mediastinum. There are some other trunks, but those are the ones I want you to know for this class. Okay. Lymphatic ducts, there are only two. Yay us. Okay, yay them. First, all fluid from the lower half of the body drains to, all lymph fluid drains to something called the cisterna chyli. If you've ever seen a cistern, it's like a large water container that you might see on a farm or a ranch or something for feeding livestock. The cisterna chyli, chyle is digested fat or absorbed fat, and so cisterna chyli is a cistern, a storage tank for absorbed fat from the intestines. And they've actually seen that fat bubbles up the thoracic duct a little at a time, so that rather than having a massive dose of fat enter your bloodstream every time you digest a meal, it kind of bubbles in a little at a time. Okay, now that brings us to the first of the major, the first of the two ducts, the thoracic duct. Has this sort of candy cane shape. It travels up behind the aorta and flips over and drains its liquid into the left subclavian vein. Okay. The other is the right lymphatic duct, and it is a very short, little stubby 1 centimeter long vessel that sits right there and empties into the right subclavian vein. Now what you'll notice in this drawing is that they've color-coded the body. The green side the green quarter of the body drains into the right lymphatic duct. The pink or reddish 3/4 of the body drains into the thoracic duct. Not quite fair, but that's the way the body works. Okay, so that's a summary of lymphatic anatomy, or the anatomy and physiology of the lymphatic circulation. We'll cover the lymphoid organs and tissues in a later lecture. Thank you and good luck.